In the blazing heat of an Egyptian summer in 31 BCE, a queen stood on the deck of her gilded flagship, watching the horizon where the fate of the ancient world would be decided. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly before her, its blue waters concealing the approaching storm that would either crown her the master of Rome or destroy the last pharaoh of Egypt forever. This was Cleopatra VII, ruler of the wealthiest kingdom on earth, and she was about to make the most catastrophic gamble in human history. What unfolded in the waters near Actium was not just another battle between rival Roman generals. It was the collision of two civilizations, the death throes of an empire that had endured for 3,000 years, and the birth of a new world order that would reshape the Mediterranean forever. The stakes could not have been higher. On one side stood the last pharaoh, commanding the legendary wealth of the Nile and the naval might of Egypt. On the other waited Augustus Caesar, the cold and calculating heir of Julius Caesar, determined to claim absolute power over Rome and its dominions. The roots of this cataclysmic confrontation stretched back decades into the tangled web of Roman civil wars and Egyptian politics. But to understand how Cleopatra's desperate gamble doomed not just herself, but an entire civilization, we must journey back to the glittering palaces of Alexandria, where the most powerful woman in the ancient world was already planning her empire's survival. Alexandria in the 1st century BCE was a city unlike any other on earth. Its towering lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, guided ships laden with treasures from India, Arabia, and beyond into the greatest harbor of the ancient Mediterranean. The streets buzzed with merchants, scholars, and diplomats speaking dozens of languages. Gold flowed through the markets like water, and in the royal quarter, the Ptolemaic palace complex sprawled across acres of marble and gardens that rivaled the courts of kings. But beneath this dazzling prosperity lay a kingdom under siege. Rome's civil wars had torn the Mediterranean apart for generations, and Egypt, despite its wealth, found itself increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The old certainties were crumbling. The Seleucid Empire had fallen to Rome. The kingdoms of Asia Minor had been absorbed. One by one, the heirs of Alexander the Great's conquests were disappearing into the maw of Roman expansion. Cleopatra understood this reality better than any ruler of her time. She was no mere ceremonial queen, but a shrewd political operator who had clawed her way to power in a dynasty notorious for its internecine violence. Her ancestors had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions into a unique civilization that controlled the crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, as the last of the Ptolemies, she faced a choice that would echo through history. The queen's strategy was audacious in its scope and devastating in its consequences. Rather than submit to Roman domination like so many other rulers, Cleopatra chose to gamble everything on reshaping the balance of power itself. She would not merely survive Rome's civil wars, she would exploit them. By aligning herself with the right Roman strongmen, she could preserve Egypt's independence while positioning herself as a power broker in the new world order. Her first calculated risk had been Julius Caesar himself. When the great conqueror arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey, Cleopatra saw opportunity where others saw danger. The legendary scene of her arrival hidden in a carpet was more than romantic theater. It was a masterstroke of political theater designed to capture Caesar's attention and imagination. The alliance that followed transformed both their destinies. Caesar's wealth and military genius combined with Egypt's vast resources created a partnership that briefly seemed capable of reshaping the Mediterranean world. Egyptian gold flowed into Caesar's campaigns, while Roman legions secured Egypt's borders. For a few glorious years, it appeared that Cleopatra's gamble might succeed beyond her wildest dreams. But Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March shattered those dreams and forced Cleopatra into an even more desperate wager. The Roman world erupted into chaos as Caesar's heirs battled for supremacy. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and heir to his eastern ambitions, emerged as the most powerful figure in the region. Once again, Cleopatra faced a choice between submission and alliance. This time, the stakes were even higher. Antony was not Caesar. Where Caesar had been calculating and methodical, Antony was passionate and impulsive. Their partnership would be more than political. It would be personal, romantic, and ultimately tragic. But for Cleopatra, personal feelings were secondary to the survival of her kingdom. The economic foundation of Cleopatra's strategy was staggering in its ambition. Egypt's annual revenues had reached 12,000 talents, surpassing even some of Rome's wealthiest provinces. The Queen's financial reforms had stabilized the currency and expanded trade networks that stretched from Britain to India. Egyptian merchants dominated commerce in luxury goods, spices, and precious metals. The kingdom's agricultural abundance could feed armies and cities across the Mediterranean, but wealth alone would not be enough. Cleopatra recognized that military power and political legitimacy were equally crucial. Her alliance with Antony provided both. Together, they commanded the eastern half of the Roman world, controlling territories from Greece to Syria, from the Black Sea to the Red Sea. Their combined fleets dominated the eastern Mediterranean, while their armies included battle-hardened Roman legions and elite Egyptian units. The Queen's vision extended beyond mere survival. She dreamed of creating a new kind of empire, one that blended Roman military might with Egyptian wealth and culture. Alexandria would become the equal of Rome, perhaps its superior. The Ptolemaic dynasty would not merely endure, it would flourish as the ruling house of a new Mediterranean order. Yet even as Cleopatra marshaled her resources and forged her alliances, her enemies in Rome were preparing their own gambit. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, was younger than Antony, but possessed a cold intelligence that made him perhaps the most dangerous man in the Mediterranean. He understood that the struggle for Rome's future would ultimately be decided not in Italy, but in the wealthy provinces of the East. The propaganda war began long before the first ship set sail for battle. Octavian's agents spread rumors throughout Rome about Antony's supposed corruption by Eastern luxury and his domination by a foreign queen. They portrayed Cleopatra not as a legitimate ruler defending her kingdom, but as a scheming sorceress who had bewitched Roman generals with her feminine wiles. This was more than mere character assassination. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign to transform a Roman civil war into a patriotic struggle against foreign invasion. By declaring war on Cleopatra rather than Antony directly, Octavian avoided the stigma of attacking a fellow Roman while rallying support against an external enemy. As the conflict escalated, both sides began preparing for what all knew would be a decisive confrontation. Antony and Cleopatra established their base at Ephesus, gathering ships and soldiers from across their domains. The Queen's contribution was massive, 20,000 talents in gold and silver, enough to fund entire campaigns. Egyptian grain ships supplied the armies, while Alexandria's shipyards worked day and night to build warships. The logistics alone were staggering. Hundreds of vessels had to be equipped, manned, and supplied for what might be a prolonged campaign. Tens of thousands of soldiers needed weapons, armor, and provisions. Intelligence networks stretched across the Mediterranean, gathering information about enemy movements and intentions. By the spring of 31 BCE, the stage was set for the most consequential naval battle in ancient history. Two fleets, representing two visions of the Mediterranean's future, prepared to meet in the waters off the Greek coast. The outcome would determine not just the fate of Rome's civil wars, but the destiny of civilizations. The waters off Actium in September 31 BCE held secrets that would reshape the ancient world. As dawn broke on the second day of September, mist clung to the surface of the Ionian Sea, shrouding the opposing fleets in ghostly silence. But this was no ordinary morning. The fate of empires hung in the balance as 250 of the largest warships ever built prepared to clash in a battle that would echo through millennia. Cleopatra's flagship, resplendent in gold and purple, rode at anchor among the Egyptian squadron. Her vessel was more than a warship. It was a floating palace, equipped with luxurious quarters and ceremonial chambers befitting the last pharaoh. Around her, the combined fleets of Egypt and the eastern Roman provinces stretched across the horizon. These were not the nimble galleys of earlier naval warfare, but massive quinqueremes and larger vessels, floating fortresses bristling with siege engines and packed with marines. The Queen herself stood on the deck in the pre-dawn darkness, her mind racing through the calculations that had brought her to this moment. Every decision of the past months had led to this point. The choice of Actium as the battleground, the deployment of her treasury ships behind the main battle line, the careful positioning of her most loyal commanders. Nothing had been left to chance. Yet everything depended on the unpredictable chaos of naval combat. Across the narrow strait, Octavian's fleet waited in disciplined silence. Marcus Agrippa, the most brilliant naval commander of his generation, had spent weeks studying the currents, winds, and tactical possibilities of these waters. His ships were smaller than those of his opponents, but they carried advantages that would prove decisive: speed, maneuverability, and above all, unity of command. The strategic situation was more complex than either side had anticipated. Antony's officers had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the influence of their Egyptian ally. Roman pride chafed at taking orders from a foreign queen, no matter how wealthy or powerful. Whispers of discontent rippled through the camps, and some of Antony's most trusted lieutenants had already begun secret negotiations with Octavian's agents. For Cleopatra, these political undercurrents represented another layer of the gamble she had undertaken. She could not simply win the battle. She had to win it in a way that preserved her authority and legitimacy. A victory that left her dependent on Roman goodwill would be little better than defeat. She needed a triumph that would establish her as an equal partner in the new order, not a junior ally to be discarded when convenient. The battle began with the thunderous crash of bronze rams against timber hulls. Octavian's lighter vessels darted between the massive ships of the opposing fleet, seeking to isolate and overwhelm individual targets. The sound was deafening, a symphony of splintering wood, clashing bronze, and the roars of fighting men. Arrows darkened the sky as archers on both sides sought to clear enemy decks before the ships closed for boarding actions. Cleopatra's naval tactics revealed the sophistication of her planning. Rather than commit her entire fleet to a single massive engagement, she had divided her forces into multiple squadrons, each with specific objectives. Some were tasked with breaking through Octavian's line to reach open water. Others were ordered to protect the treasure ships that carried Egypt's portable wealth. Still others formed a reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough or cover a retreat if the battle turned against them. The Queen's personal involvement in the fighting was unprecedented for a ruler of her status. Ancient sources describe her moving between ships, directing the battle from the deck of her flagship while arrows whistled overhead. This was not mere symbolic leadership, but hands-on command of naval forces in the heat of combat. Her presence inspired fierce loyalty among her Egyptian crews, who fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. But as the morning wore on, the tide of battle began to shift. Agrippa's tactical brilliance became apparent as his lighter ships systematically isolated and destroyed larger enemy vessels. The Roman fleet's superior coordination allowed them to concentrate their forces at crucial points while preventing their opponents from bringing their full strength to bear. Ship after ship of the Allied fleet was rammed, boarded, or set ablaze. The moment of crisis came when it became clear that the main engagement was lost. Antony's flagship, surrounded and taking heavy damage, could no longer effectively command the battle. Many of his Roman officers, sensing defeat, began to consider surrender or defection. The carefully constructed alliance between Rome and Egypt was fracturing under the pressure of imminent disaster. It was then that Cleopatra made the decision that would define her legacy. Rather than fight to the last ship and see her fleet destroyed piecemeal, she ordered a coordinated breakthrough. Her personal squadron, protected by the elite ships of the Egyptian navy, would attempt to escape the trap and preserve what they could of their forces. This was not cowardice, but cold, strategic calculation. A living queen with ships and treasure could continue the fight. A dead martyr could not. The breakout was a masterpiece of naval maneuvering, executed under impossible conditions. Egyptian ships formed a protective wedge around Cleopatra's flagship, ramming through the Roman line with desperate fury. The Queen's personal galley, its golden prow cutting through the chaos, led the escape as her loyal captains sacrificed themselves to clear her path to open water. Behind them, the remnants of the Allied fleet fought on with diminishing hope. Antony, realizing that his political and personal partner was escaping, made his own desperate decision. Abandoning his flagship and the Roman officers who had served him faithfully, he transferred to a smaller vessel and followed Cleopatra's wake toward Egypt. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. Roman soldiers and sailors watched in amazement as their commander abandoned them to follow a foreign queen. The propaganda value for Octavian was immense. Here was proof of everything his agents had whispered about Antony's corruption by Eastern influence. As Cleopatra's ships disappeared over the horizon, carrying with them the last hope of Egyptian independence, the battle's outcome became inevitable. The remaining ships of the Allied fleet, leaderless and demoralized, either surrendered or were destroyed. The waters of Actium ran red with blood, and the wreckage of the largest naval battle in ancient history littered the coastline for miles. Yet even in defeat, Cleopatra's strategic vision remained intact. The treasure ships that had escaped with her carried enough wealth to fund continued resistance. Egypt's borders remained secure, its armies intact. The war was lost, but the kingdom survived to fight another day. The queen's gamble had failed, but it had not yet completely destroyed the civilization she sought to preserve. The journey back to Alexandria was a race against time and political collapse. News of the defeat would spread quickly, encouraging rebellions and defections throughout the eastern provinces. Cleopatra had to reach her capital before her enemies could organize against her, before the myth of Egyptian invincibility crumbled entirely. The return to Alexandria was a journey through collapsing dreams and crumbling alliances. As Cleopatra's battered fleet limped southward along the Egyptian coast, messengers raced ahead carrying news that would shake the foundations of the ancient world. The queen, who had departed months earlier as the co-ruler of half the Mediterranean, now returned as a fugitive, her grand strategy in ruins, her kingdom's future hanging by the slenderest of threads. The capital that greeted her was already transformed by the weight of defeat. Alexandria's merchants, ever sensitive to political winds, had begun quietly moving their wealth to safer harbors. The great library's scholars whispered of uncertain times ahead. Even the palace guard seemed less confident in their bearing, as if they sensed that the world they had known was ending. Yet Cleopatra refused to accept defeat as final. In the marble halls where her ancestors had ruled for 3 centuries, she began planning one last desperate gambit. If she could not preserve Egypt through alliance with Rome, perhaps she could save it through separation from Rome entirely. The queen's agents reached out to kingdoms beyond the Mediterranean, to the Parthian Empire in the east, to the emerging powers of Arabia and Nubia. Egypt's wealth could still buy allies, even in the darkest hour. Antony's arrival in Alexandria only complicated these desperate calculations. The Roman general who had once commanded legions now found himself dependent on Egyptian protection, his own political career destroyed by his flight from Actium. The partnership that had once seemed capable of conquering the world was now reduced to 2 defeated figures clinging to the last shreds of their power. The couple's attempts to maintain their authority grew increasingly frantic and theatrical. They proclaimed themselves divine rulers, staged elaborate ceremonies, and distributed lavish gifts to anyone who might support them. But beneath the pageantry lay the harsh reality of military defeat and political isolation. Each day brought new reports of defections, surrenders, and territorial losses as Octavian's forces methodically occupied the eastern provinces. Octavian himself was in no hurry to deliver the final blow. The calculating air of Caesar understood that time was his greatest weapon. Every month of delay weakened his enemies further while strengthening his own position. His propaganda machine worked tirelessly to portray the coming campaign not as Roman aggression, but as liberation from foreign tyranny. Egyptian gold, they claimed, had corrupted Roman virtue. Now Rome would reclaim its destiny. The economic consequences of Actium began manifesting even before Octavian's armies reached Egypt's borders. Trade routes that had enriched Alexandria for generations started shifting toward Roman-controlled ports. The kingdom's currency, once accepted throughout the Mediterranean, faced growing skepticism from merchants who questioned Egypt's future stability. The annual tribute from subject territories dwindled as local governors hedged their bets or openly declared for Octavian. Cleopatra's financial reforms, once her greatest achievement, now worked against her. The centralized system that had maximized royal revenues also made the kingdom vulnerable to systematic disruption. When Roman agents began targeting key officials and trade networks, the effects rippled throughout Egypt's economy with devastating speed. The queen found herself fighting not just a military campaign, but an economic war that threatened to strangle her kingdom before any Roman soldier set foot on Egyptian soil. The psychological warfare proved equally destructive. Octavian's agents spread carefully crafted rumors designed to undermine confidence in Cleopatra's rule. They whispered that the queen planned to flee to India with Egypt's remaining treasure abandoning her subjects to Roman vengeance. They suggested that her supposed divine powers had failed her at Actium, proving her unworthiness to rule. Most damaging of all, they portrayed her as a foreign interloper who had never truly understood Egyptian interests. These propaganda attacks struck at the heart of Ptolemaic legitimacy. For 3 centuries, the Greek-descended dynasty had maintained power by carefully balancing their Macedonian heritage with Egyptian traditions. Cleopatra herself had been the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language, presenting herself as the reincarnation of Isis to her subjects. Now her enemies sought to unravel this delicate synthesis, portraying her as neither truly Egyptian nor acceptably Roman. As winter gave way to spring in 30 BCE, the noose tightened around Egypt's neck. Octavian's forces had secured Syria and were advancing through Palestine toward the Sinai. The Roman fleet controlled the eastern Mediterranean, cutting off potential escape routes and blocking aid from any remaining allies. Most ominously, defections had begun within Egypt itself, as provincial governors and military commanders calculated the odds of survival under continued Ptolemaic rule. Cleopatra's response to these mounting pressures revealed both her strengths and her fatal weaknesses as a ruler. Her intelligence network, built over decades of political intrigue, provided detailed information about enemy movements and intentions. Her personal charisma still inspired fierce loyalty among her closest supporters. Her understanding of statecraft remained sophisticated even in desperate circumstances, but the Queen's greatest strength, her willingness to gamble everything on bold strategic moves, had become a liability. Each desperate throw of the dice had raised the stakes higher while reducing her margin for error. The alliance with Caesar had worked brilliantly until his assassination. The partnership with Antony had seemed promising until Actium. Now, with her options nearly exhausted, Cleopatra prepared for one final wager that would determine not just her own fate, but the destiny of one of history's greatest civilizations. The preparations for Egypt's last stand revealed the kingdom's enduring strengths, even in its death throes. Alexandria's workshops produced weapons and armor, with craftsmanship that rivaled anything in the Mediterranean world. The royal navy, though battered at Actium, retained enough vessels to contest control of the Nile Delta. Most importantly, the kingdom's vast wealth could still hire mercenaries and buy time for diplomatic solutions. Yet these advantages were offset by fundamental weaknesses that no amount of gold could remedy. Egypt's military traditions had atrophied under centuries of Ptolemaic rule, leaving the kingdom dependent on foreign mercenaries and Roman tactical expertise. The population, though prosperous, had little experience of the kind of desperate warfare that now threatened their homeland. Most critically, the kingdom lacked the unified national identity that might have sustained prolonged resistance against foreign conquest. As Octavian's armies approached the borders of Egypt, the last pharaoh faced the ultimate test of her reign. Everything she had worked for, everything her ancestors had built, hung in the balance. The gamble that had begun with such promise in the palaces of Alexandria was approaching its final, tragic conclusion. The ancient land of the pharaohs, which had survived Persian conquest, Macedonian occupation, and Roman interference, now faced absorption into an empire that would reshape the Mediterranean world according to its own vision. The stage was set for the final act of a drama that had begun with the death of Alexander the Great and would end with the transformation of the ancient world. In the coming months, the fate of Egypt, the legacy of the Ptolemies, and the future of Mediterranean civilization would all be decided by the courage, cunning, and desperation of a queen who had dared to challenge the might of Rome itself. The final months of Cleopatra's reign unfolded like a Greek tragedy written in blood and gold. As Octavian's legions crossed into Egypt in the summer of 30 BCE, the queen, who had once commanded the loyalty of half the Mediterranean, found herself trapped in a kingdom that was slowly but inexorably slipping from her grasp. The great gamble that had begun with such audacious promise was now approaching its inevitable catastrophic conclusion. Alexandria, the jewel of the Ptolemaic crown, became a city under siege not just by Roman armies, but by the weight of its own history. The lighthouse that had guided ships from across the known world for centuries now served as a watchtower for enemy vessels blockading the harbor. The great library, repository of human knowledge since the days of Alexander, echoed with the whispered fears of scholars who sensed that an entire civilization was ending before their eyes. In the royal palace, Cleopatra made her final preparations with the methodical precision that had characterized her entire reign. She ordered the construction of a magnificent tomb, not as an act of surrender, but as a statement of royal dignity that would outlast the collapse of her kingdom. The structure, filled with treasures beyond imagination, was designed to be her last bargaining chip with the Roman conqueror, who now held her destiny in his hands. The Queen's final gambit was perhaps the most desperate of her career. If she could not preserve Egypt's independence, she might at least secure favorable terms for her children and her people. Messages flowed between the besieged palace and Octavian's headquarters, each carrying offers of submission, appeals for mercy, and increasingly frantic attempts to find some path to survival that would preserve even a shadow of Ptolemaic authority. And so the last pharaoh's final gamble ended not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet hiss of an asp against royal flesh. Cleopatra's death marked more than the fall of a queen. It was the extinction of an entire world. The Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries vanished in a single moment, and with it died the last remnant of Alexander's empire. Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, became a Roman province, its vast wealth flowing north to feed the ambitions of a new master. Cleopatra had gambled everything on reshaping the Mediterranean, and in losing, she had sealed the fate of the ancient world forever.